Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm down here to feed my two African nightcrawler bins that are over there in the corner. They're 200 days of age today. And this is actually take two because the first time I came down here earlier today with a tray of food for them, I somehow got my wires crossed and I ended up putting that food into the European nightcrawler bins down there, which certainly didn't need to be fed because they had just been fed 3 days prior. So yeah, I think those two bins are going to be good for a couple weeks with all that food that was placed in there. But now that I kind of got my head on straight, hopefully this time, we're going to return to the bins that I intended to visit in on today. The 200-day-old African nightcrawler bins, which have not been fed now for 11 days, so I believe that they're due. And the stuff they got last time was a bunch of kitchen scraps that I actually found down in one of the drawers on the bottom of the refrigerator. Some of the stuff was already liquid. There was like some cucumbers that were pretty much mush and some grapes, I believe. And it was kind of funny because I was looking for those items when I was feeding the European nightcrawler bins earlier. And I couldn't find them, and that was already my first clue that there was something wrong. But now I think I've got the right bins in my sights. It's these two systems here, and you can even see this one was left with no cover to let it dry off a little bit. We must have found that it was a bit too damp last time. So we're going to get these systems up on the bench. We'll start with bin number 1, we'll get to bin number 2, and we're going to get them fed. As you can see, the amount of food that I've got for them is pretty substantial. It's got a good amount of weight to it. So each system will get a banana peel and a good big handful of lettuce. And I think there's even a little bit of orange peel down at the bottom. So we'll try to put a little bit of orange peel into each system as well. That stuff all came out of my freezer with the exception of the orange peel. So most of that stuff should just turn to mush as soon as it starts to thaw out and change to room temperature. So now this is what's left of what we had put in here as our feeding zone indicator. It's a coffee filter. And it's pretty much gone. The worms just nibbled it away. Luckily I've got a replacement here for it. The other system where it was left out here on the top with the dry material, that one is untouched, so that'll have a feeding zone indicator, but this one needs a replacement. So luckily I had one here on the side that we can make use of. Some of the stuff I'm finding right here on the top surface are already some leftover food bits. I noticed right off the bat that's one right there, a banana stem. And another one, 2 of them, and possibly even more. Here's a third one, I think, or maybe that's something else, I don't even know. So those are the sort of things that definitely benefit from being in the thick of the action, where all the moisture and all the food and everything else is. So having that stuff floating out here on the top surface, this might even be what's left of a banana stem right there. So I think it'll make good sense to grab those leftover bits that we found floating out here on the top and include them with the feeding. That'll highly increase their likelihood of getting nibbled away. So now I think I definitely remembered grapes, and I definitely a piece of lime. Definitely remembered grapes, definitely remembered cucumbers that were pretty much liquefied. And how much of that we're going to find as leftovers, I do not know. None of that stuff that we gave them last time was frozen. It came straight out of my fridge. It was really gross. Had to go. So here's a grape. It's still got a good amount of moisture content to it. I think we'll start piling up our leftovers that we encounter off on the side here. And now this right here, a stem of a pumpkin, would not have been part of what they received last time. That would go way back. And here's another stem of a banana peel. Those are the sort of things that generally stick around for quite some time in a worm bin. This is also the same stuff, but this is one of those ends where when you buy a bunch of bananas and they're all connected together, this is that place where you break off each individual banana. So this is sort of that bunch connector. I never know what to call it. I always come up with some sort of different name for it. I don't know, today it just seemed like there weren't quite as many worms hanging out on it as there usually are. So this is just a little bit more of the same stuff. And, you know, I mean, since grapes were part of the food they got last time, I don't even know if I really want to go too out of my way picking every grape out of here as we go down. But I'll see what I could do about, you know, picking out the leftover bits of food and identify them as we go. This is a corn cob. Some of it's self-evident when you look at it. Some of it's not. So let's just go a little bit more wholesale here instead of being so delicate. Let's just upturn the feeding area so we can get their feeding in today. I think we've got enough room in here to go pretty generous on bedding. It's kind of the theme in all my systems, but it somehow seems like this system just hasn't really caught on, or hasn't really seen the effects of my drive lately to get most of my systems built out to make better use of the available space in such a way that, you know, we're actually using the space instead of leaving it half empty. So my thinking today was, since I came down here earlier and prepared a whole bunch of fresh bedding, I thought we would go pretty generous on the bedding down in here today as we apply their food. And I think that that's just something that these types of worms are going to definitely appreciate, since it's their 200th day in service. We'll kind of treat it almost like a little bit of a birthday celebration and give them a whole bunch of stuff that they really like, which is bedding. These are African night crawlers, and they definitely like their bedding, so they'll probably appreciate the bedding just as much as they appreciate the kitchen scraps. So I just somehow can't seem to resist trying to pick out the leftovers. Every now and then my eye catches a little piece of leftover this, leftover that, and I just keep stacking it up over there on the side. But I think we're kind of at that point where I can go fetch the bedding that I prepared earlier, so we can pile it in here and get these little guys fed. So I've definitely opened up a large enough chasm here, but I just keep bumping into leftover bits of, you know, stems of bananas, so many of them in here, and pieces of corn cob. But I think we've got ourselves a large enough opening here to do a reset on the feeding zone, so let's get that started. Alright, so you can see I actually have a somewhat more colorful and vibrant looking prepared bedding here today than I usually do. I used a bunch of these colorful napkins and a bunch of colorful paper to make this stuff, but I don't want to reach in there. I just noticed that I've got a whole bunch of itsy bitsy little tiny baby worms all over my gloves, and as much as the worms would probably appreciate getting dumped into a nice fresh batch of shredded paper and cardboard and leaves and water that my prepared bedding is made up of, I'd prefer to keep all the worms in the bin that they belong in. So I think it's safe now to reach into our supply of pretty much brand new, freshly prepared bedding. And it's a pretty nice portion, got to admit. And you know what? I'm even thinking of dressing this up even further. You know what? I'm going to get my supply of leaves. Here we go. So now, even though this stuff has tiny little particles of leaves mixed into it everywhere, I figured, why don't we just give them a nice large handful of autumn leaves. And now that's definitely a nice build out of their environment, if you ask me. It's a good, I don't know. I mean, it'll all collapse in time. It'll definitely become less, but for now, I think it's a good enhancement to the overall size of the system. And now I believe we could start plopping in today's feeding. So each system's going to get a banana peel, as well as another fresh banana stem, even though there's just so many of them in here already. And you know what? Let's start plopping in all this older food too, all these corn cob bits and old banana stem pieces, and I guess all this other stuff that we sort of collected in the beginning too. We sort of scraped up a variety of different materials off the top surface. Another corn cob. Here's a pretty good size object. This is that pumpkin stem we saw in the beginning. More corn cob. The lime, which seems to be doing pretty good. Even though some people treat citrus as a forbidden food item in the worm bins, I don't really see it that way. I don't think it's a problem. I think they do just fine eating it. Alright, I think that's everything. This unusual banana stem thing. I'm sure there's a real word for that, whatever that is, that connector that all the bananas hang off of in the bunch, but I don't know the proper word for it, so I just keep referring to it as the bunch connector? I don't know. Now, in with the actual feeding, the lettuce, and there's a good bit of it here. And this came out of my freezer, and some of it, like this chunk here in the middle, is pretty much a big bundle. Let's see what I could do about breaking it apart a little bit. And lettuce, we know it's just one of those foods that's going to go nice and quick. I think it's going to be eaten 1, 2, 3 if you ask me. And I think we've left a couple pieces of orange peel in here for the other system, so why don't we save the rest for the other bin? This is probably enough to get them going. And we should have enough material floating out on the edges of the system to cover up with. We'll also kind of till up the outer edges. See if we can get a look at how things on the outer edges are looking. I'm curious about the other system to see how it feels in terms of moisture level, because the reason we would have left the top off last time is we wouldn't have found the material to be nice and crumbly and loose like this stuff all here is. We probably found that it was kind of clumping up into little mud balls. And if we can find that the material has dried to this extent where it kind of crumbles loosely the way this stuff here does, then we'll know that we've allowed enough time for it to dry to the proper moisture level. Because even though the stuff crumbles and is nice and loose, it's certainly got a good moisture level too. It's not dry even though it crumbles loosely. It's got like just the right moisture level to it. And it's full of worms too, so that's usually a pretty good sign as well. So I think from the moisture perspective, this bin is pretty much on the money in terms of what I like to see. I'm a little bit surprised at how many worms we're finding in these outer edges. You would think that they'd be down in the feeding area, nibbling on all those leftovers of corn cobs and whatever else was down there, but it almost seems like there's just as many worms out here on the edge as there are in the middle. Which just goes to show that the material, even though it looks like finished castings, is still stuff that the worms can find all kinds of nourishment in. So that is good. They'll just continue to cruise through the entire contents of the bin, working it all down for us. I think the reason we're able to do it that way so nicely is because of the plastic covering. The plastic covering just does such a nice job keeping the moisture level so even throughout the entire system that the worms are comfortable going almost anywhere. Alright, very nice. So, in the place of what had been there but had gotten nibbled away so badly that it was barely even recognizable anymore, the feeding zone indicator that they pretty much did away with is now being replaced with a nice new one. And I guess the other thing I sometimes like to do is put a little bit of top covering paper out here as well. So why don't we grab a piece of newspaper? I'm just going to reach over here to my little supply of newspaper on the side, and here's a piece we can sort of tear in half and almost cover the entire top surface. And I should have another piece right here in this package to do the other one with. So that's bin number 1 of 2, celebrating its 200th day in service, getting a nice celebratory meal and a good amount of bedding to help build out the system further. And unusually there's a bunch of stuff within the bag. I don't know how that ended up in there. I figured I would shake it out and drop it into the bin because it's probably a better place for that stuff to be. And this bin right here is a little bit wider than most of my systems. I've got a few of these larger size bins. Most of them are a little bit narrower, and that this large plastic bag actually goes edge to edge, but on these wider bins there's a little bit of space for the system to breathe. So luckily, since the castings hold on to their moisture so nicely, it doesn't really matter too much if that little edge dries in both of these sides. All right, on to bin number 2. So this is that plastic covering that had been left off for the past 11 days. And at the end, I'm assuming we're going to be able to put it right back on and get the system, you know, recirculating its moisture again, assuming that things have dried out sufficiently enough in here to permit that. And this thing is held out good since it's been left completely dry. The worms haven't touched it. So let's check it out. I think I will sort of collect up all of this dry stuff so that we can make a real distinct effort to make sure that all of it gets submerged into a place where it's going to be able to rehydrate and all get back into action. So right now some of it is just like little tough boulders. So I think by piling it up over here, we'll be able to remind ourselves that this is what we want to get back down into the feeding zone, I believe, as possibly the foundation for this feeding, where it'll definitely moisten back up again, assuming we could cover up again. I'm assuming we probably can. Hopefully we can. Because once we blend all that dry stuff in down within the system, it's going to help further dry the contents of this bin further. Oh man, even more. So I guess the worms are out here in force. Look at this leftovers. We got some nice lime here too. I'm already seeing a grape. It's funny because I didn't really see that many grapes when we were excavating the other bin. Maybe they ate the majority of them and I just got lucky by finding one. And maybe the majority of them were actually already consumed, which would be kind of cool. So like we did before, if we bump into some leftovers, we'll just set them aside. I think this is actually a piece of pumpkin stem right here, because I had a pumpkin stem which shattered, and I was attempting to keep the pieces of it nearby so we can sort of keep them together. So these might actually belong together right there. And this piece actually just fell off too. So it's starting to really break down nicely. Lots of worms down here in the feeding zone. Here's another grape. So I think that the grapes probably would have been eaten a little bit more quickly if they had been frozen and were put in here in such a way that they'd be thawing and getting mushy and being easier for the worms to eat as a result of that. But perhaps just because they went straight from the refrigerator drawer into the worm bin, that might be the reason that they're still lasting. Although in the past, I believe that anytime I've ever fed grapes, I've pretty much always found leftovers of this stuff for weeks and weeks afterwards. So maybe that's just the nature of grapes. Lots and lots of worms hanging out down here in the feeding area. And I could see the worms wanting to stay clear of the top surface since it was rather dry and inhospitable out on the surface. So by letting the top surface dry, we somewhat limited their roaming space within this system. But I think that things are feeling pretty good, you know? If things feel pretty good already right down here where the feeding was applied, I would have to assume that the outer edges are probably also equally crumbly and loose and somewhat dried out to the point where we can feel safe putting the plastic covers back on this system. Yeah, at first I felt like we had a bin that had somewhat fewer worms in it than the other one, but now I'm starting to think that we're doing pretty good in here. We got a lot of worms hanging out. Alright, I'm going to let these little guys settle into the material one more time. This time though, I want to make sure I knock off all the worms from my glove instead of risking having them fall off and end up on the floor somewhere. There we go, one more. There we go. Now here too, I'd like to see about building out the system's available space to increase it. And let's not forget about all that stuff we scraped off the top surface. That's all going to go right down into the feeding area too. So let's just increase the space down here in this hole by a little bit more, just to make sure we've given ourselves ample space to not only bring all that dry material from the surface down in, but also include a whole bunch of nice fresh bedding to build the system out with, like we did in the other bin. So you know what? Let's mix it up a little bit. Let's make sure we don't have any worms on our glove before we go reaching into our prepared bedding supply. Let's see if we can get this done before the worms collapse the hole we just dug open. So we're going to begin by starting with a nice generous handful of this stuff down at the bottom. And in can go a nice handful of leaves too. Ooh, that's a good bit. Maybe a little bit more than the last system got. But then we've got all these leftover bits, as well as all this dry material from the top surface that I wanted to get down into the feeding area. And it's going in right there on top of a bunch of other dry material, on top of all those dry leaves. But I think by being submerged, and then we're going to cover up again with the plastic, I got a feeling everything's going to hydrate nicely. And here we've still got I know we've still got a few more leftovers here. There was a pumpkin stem, a fragmented pumpkin stem, which is those three bits right there, and this lime. So we've already built things up quite nicely over here, but we've not even added the fresh food yet. So let's make that happen. So let's see. In goes the banana peel. Very nice. And on top of that, all of this delicious lettuce, and that little orange peel was in here too, I believe, right? Just so we can be fair and consistent. Okay. I took a moment before to prepare some top covering pieces of newspaper that we could drape over the top alongside the feeding zone indicator, sort of like we did in the other system. So I think the worms like that, especially when it's a spot where all that recirculating moisture that's kind of doing a terrarium effect underneath the top covering plastic. Here's some more pumpkin. No, that's, what was that? That was piece of corn cob. So yeah, I think the top covering paper bits are kind of popular. I mean, you saw in the first bin how that feeding zone indicator had been just completely nibbled away by the worms. And I think as long as we keep covering up with plastic and the top covering paper keeps getting soaked from the recirculating moisture, it's always going to be a nice popular spot. Oh yeah. Every now and then you just kind of bump into a big pile of worms, which is always so much fun. Alright, over here we piled a bunch of material up. This too had a whole bunch of worms in it. Let's see about backfilling this opposite end a bit more so we can excavate and inspect how the material on this end looks, but I think I'm not really seeing any reason for concern in terms of things being too damp anymore. I mean, here you see some stuff that's sort of clumping together, but certainly not too bad. I think just by putting in all those dry leaves and submerging all the dry material that had been out on the surface, and then covering it all up so that the plastic covering forces sort of a equalization of the moisture throughout, I think things in here are going to be pretty nice by the next time we get in here to check out how things are coming along. Yeah, lots and lots of worms everywhere. Nice busy bin. Alright, well, let's get things leveled off so we can cover up. I do like the idea of continuing to try to build the capacity of the system up closer to its limit instead of kind of treating that as an end goal, instead of working my way to the point where eventually a system reaches that point. To me, it just seems more sensible to start right out running a bin almost full assuming you got enough worms to handle that much material. And then as they continue breaking it down, continue to just backfill it and compensate for what they've eaten. And then they've just, in a continuous sort of way, always have a good bit of material to hang out in. And by having a large amount of material to hang out in, they'll sense that extra real estate or a greater amount of space to live in. And I believe that'll often trigger a behavior in the worms of trying to fill that space with baby worms. All right, very nice. Fun system. So that's it for our check-in with the African night crawlers on day 200. Feeding the correct system now versus feeding the incorrect system. And I'm trying to remember now. I'm thinking that these were actually the systems in which we were constantly battling with the potatoes trying to grow. And I don't remember seeing even a trace of potato on this go-around. But then again, I don't trust my memory today. I could just be getting this mixed up with another system, so I'll just leave it at that. I got a few things I got to take care of, getting cleaned up, put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.